So for this week's lesson, we are going to be introducing something new. We are doing the third of the 3 different types of interlocks which we can build into our forward and reverse control. And the actual change we're going to make to the control circuit is really very almost minuscule. It's a very small adjustment. Okay, the control, the forward and reverse control, will look the very same, stacking 2 3-wire controls essentially on top of each other. It is that last instruction, which is the interlock, which is going to get changed for us. Okay, so in terms of the adjustment we're going to have to make to our control circuit, it's very minor. We are once again going to include the power circuit and have the motor actually operational. The learning this week, the real adjustment for us is going to be the fact that we are going to use a different motor starter. I don't know if you've even noticed that it's here at the lab station, but we're going to move over and use a different piece of equipment. So up until now, we've been using the Allen Bradley motor starter. Okay, we at this point I think should be very familiar with it. Okay, we're going to move over this time, and we're going to use the much larger square D or NEMA motor starter. Okay, there's a very good reason for that, which is part of what we have to build. But it's also a really nice opportunity for you to get some exposure to something different. Okay, they're both motor starters, and so there are a great many things about them that are the same, but things get moved around a little bit. So the look and the feel is a little bit different. Where you go to find particular terminals to land your wire, it gets moved around. Okay, so it's a really nice opportunity for you to get a chance to see how they are the same and how they're different. Okay, so we need to do a little bit of an introduction here so that when you get into the lab and you start wiring up your circuit, you're going to be familiar with this other motor starter, the NEMA motor starter. Okay, so let's take a look at it and recognize the things that are the same and the things that are different. So for starters, it is a motor starter, which means it is comprised of 2 contactors. So there they are, mounted side by side, 2 contactors. And underneath we have an overload. Okay, so definitely the overload looks much different, okay, but it is still the same 3 components that make up the unit, which is the motor starter. Okay, now let's look at what else is the same. We have line 1, line 2, and line 3 here at the top of the first contactor. We have line 1, line 2, and line 3 here at the top of the second contactor. And so on the bottom, we have T1, T2, and T3, and unfortunately, again, just like before, not very well labeled, but there it is, the 3 screws on the bottom of the overload. Okay? Beyond that, the similarities are really just in terms of the functionality. So they still do the same thing, right? We energize the coil, it closes the contacts, which allows the power to flow through to feed the motor. Okay? But now things start to move around on us. Okay, how do we energize the coil? So over here in the Allen Bradley motor starters, the contactors, we have A1 and A2 mounted right up on top. Okay, we've become fairly familiar with that. There they are. Over here, there's no such connections up top, no such terminals up here to place our wires to energize the coil. So where the heck do we go to find A1 and A2? Well, that's these 2 terminals right here on the face of the motor starter. So here we are, A1 and A2 of the first contactor here on the left, A1 and A2 of the second contactor here on the right. Okay, so they've moved, they've been relocated a little bit, okay, but they're still there and they still do the same thing. The other really significant difference is, and you may have noticed this when I went through this, okay, there is no 4th normally open contact here on the NEMA contactors. So on the Allen Bradleys, we have line 1, line 2, and line 3, and then we have the 4th normally open contact, which we have used consistently now, repeatedly, as our holding contact. That doesn't exist in these motor starters. They just have line 1, line 2, and line 3. That's in recognition that they have to be rated for a certain current for whatever motor they're feeding. Okay, they have to be robust. They have to be rated for a considerable amount of current. This 4th normally open has the same design and the same rating here in the motor starters that we've been using, but that's not really necessary. okay, the amount of current flowing through the holding contact is really very minimal. It's just enough to energize the coil of the motor starter. And so it can be a much smaller contact. It doesn't have to be these large double make-break contacts. They can be a single make-break contact. And the fact of the matter is I don't even know the construction internally, but my suspicion is it's just a single make-break point on what we use for a holding contact because it doesn't occupy a large space here in the contactor as we have in the Allen Bradley. In fact, where you find the holding contact, there are two terminals tucked way up here in the back on the top left. Okay, there's one here on the first contactor and another one tucked in here on the second one. Okay, so there's no indication of how big this contact actually is. My suspicion is it's very small. All we have access to are these two little terminals that we have to get our wires connected to. And so this is a normally open contact that is there pretty much explicitly for the purpose of being your holding contact within your control circuit. Okay, so that's where we find that fourth normally open for our holding contact. Okay, it's just a couple of screws in the top left. Okay, there's a similar kind of construction happening to connect our overload. Okay, here we have 4 screws across the face of the overload block. We know that the 2 on the left are for the normally open, the 2 on the right are for the normally closed. The normally open gives us an opportunity to drive a light, an indicator light, to say, hey, an overload has happened. Okay, wonderful, lovely, but not absolutely mandatory. But the normally closed, definitely mandatory, must exist in every control circuit to act as that feedback mechanism. And so we have that available to us over here, and that's all we have available. We don't have this normally open. It's only the normally closed contact connected with the overload, and it is way in underneath, and again, it's off to the left. So it's down in here, the bottom left corner in underneath the overload. There's 2 terminals just sitting here waiting, very much like the 2 terminals up here sitting and waiting, and they are the normally closed contact of the overload. Okay, so that's where you go to find those things. Now, we don't have any jumpers either. Okay, you may notice that we have pre-wired 3 wires here in the bottom. Okay, and they connect T1 to 3 and 2 to 2 and T3 across to T1. So these are our crossovers. All right, this is where the magic happens for the forward reverse control. Okay, this is where the crossover takes place. There is nothing connecting L1, L2, and L3 on the 2 contactors, and so you must put wires in there, place jumpers in there to get the power over to the second contactor for the reverse power feed. Now, to answer the question of why we're going to use the other motor starter, we actually are kind of forced to move over there, and that is because of the fact that we've run out of contacts here on this motor starter. Okay, we've already been cheating all the way along, right? We have been feeding our green pilot light and now our blue pilot light to indicate reverse. We've just been placing it in parallel with the coil, with A1. And that's not really right. Most of you have seen, and many of you have commented about the fact that when we were testing the overload, you could trip the overload, press the green button to see if it's working, and of course you couldn't energize the motor starter, but the green light would still come on. And that was because of what we had done, just paralleling the green light in with the coil. Much more appropriately, what we should be doing is actually feeding that green light from a normally open contact operated by the contactor, by the motor starter. Okay, but we've run out of those extra contacts. Okay, here's why we're moving over. We are actually going to be using an auxiliary contact to build our interlock for this lab, so we need those contacts. They're not available here. We've got to go somewhere to get them. They are available over here. They're mounted right here on the side of the motor starter, and we can stack. We have 2 on either side in our labs, but we actually could have the option of stacking many, many more. Just keep adding on, okay? Much like we would have the option of putting adder decks on here like we talked about. These get stacked on the face, something that we have not done here at the school, okay? these get added on the side, something that we have done, okay? And so we're going to move over here to the other motor starter to take advantage of the additional auxiliary contacts which we are going to need to build our interlock for this week's lab. Here you can see the two auxiliary contacts mounted on the side of the contactor. And if I push on this lever to simulate the energizing of the coil, you can see this lever on the bottom in particular. This one up top is a little bit difficult to see because of the label on top of it. But when I close this, you see that move. So you can see how the lever that's on the side of the auxiliary contact, which is inserted into the motor starter, into the contactor rather, is how the contactor can influence that auxiliary contact. And you actually see that moving as a result of me manipulating the contactor. So here's a closer look at these auxiliary contacts, and it's nice that they're see-through, so we can actually look inside them and see what's going on. Okay, so notice down here in the bottom right here in my thumb, that's the mounting screw, so we can mount this thing on the side of the contactor. Okay, we have two terminals up top to connect our wires to. Okay, and here in the top right you can see the normally open contact. Okay, now also if I spin this, you see that there's a little bit of a lever here, and that lever actually, when you mount this, gets inserted into the side of the contactor, so that when you energize the contactor, it pulls on this lever, and you can see how that plastic inside pushes the contact closed. Okay, notice here there's a spring, so this is spring loaded. That's what causes it to always return to its normal position. And so the contactor has to pull against the spring, and just the shape of that plastic in there pushes that normally open contact closed. Okay, let me grab the normally closed and look at it. Its construction is identical so that we can mount them interchangeably, put in the one that we want. Here under my thumb again is our mounting screw. Okay, up top we have our two terminals. And once again, we've got this lever that when we mount it, ends up inside the side of the motor starter. And try to stay out of the glare one more time. When I pull on this lever, this time it allows that normally closed contact to fall open. Okay, notice the spring over here on the right. That's what always pushes it back into its normal position. Okay, and it's the shape of the metal bar that it wants to be open, but the plastic is always pushing it closed when it springs back into its normal position. The coil, when it moves, is what pulls that and allows the normally closed contact to open. So it's nice that they are clear. That way we don't need labels on these. Okay, they look identical at first glance, but we can look right inside. We can actually actuate this if we wish and see what happens, and we can determine at a glance whether it's normally open or normally closed, and figure out which one it is we want to use. Okay, so hopefully that gets you the introduction you need to the auxiliary contacts and to the NEMA motor starter, and should have you well prepared for the work that we have to do this week. Again, like I said, not a great deal of learning in terms of understanding a brand new circuit. It's very much a repetition of last week's circuit with one minor tweak. Okay, the real learning curve this week, the new piece of information is figuring out this new motor starter.